Jock Bonar rolled his Hawker Typhoon inverted at 35,000 feet and pushed the nose down. He was investigating an oil scavenging problem. Routine enough work for a man in his position, the kind of systematic flight envelope testing that kept Hawker's experimental team occupied through the early war years. The brief was simple. Climb high, place the aircraft into attitudes that put unusual demands on the lubrication system, record the results. Below him, through the perspex of the canopy, England lay spread in the flat grey-yellow light of a 1942 morning, the Thames a pale line in the distance. The Typhoon accelerated fast in a vertical dive. That was one of the aircraft's genuine strengths. Its thick wing and heavy airframe converted altitude into speed with impressive efficiency, and pilots who'd learned to use a dive for tactical advantage found the Tiffy willing. At 350 miles per hour indicated, the descent felt controlled. At 420, the cockpit noise had risen beyond comfortable. The Sabre's high-pitched 24-cylinder note mixing with the vibration transmitted through the airframe into the pilot's seat, into his spine, into the back of his skull. By 480 miles per hour, the harmonic had shifted. Not to anything obviously wrong, not the sound of an engine failing, but a higher frequency in the frame and a faint judder in the stick that an experienced test pilot files away as worth noting. Past 500 miles per hour indicated, Bonar pulled back on the stick. Nothing. Not stiffness, not heaviness, nothing at all. The column moved freely, with no physical obstruction, and produced no response in the air behind him. He tried the rudder. Nothing. The ailerons. Nothing. He applied pressure systematically in all axes, with the methodical calm that men in his profession practice for precisely this kind of emergency. The calm that isn't really calm, but has learned to wear calm's face. The altimeter was unwinding through 28,000 feet. The aircraft was still vertical, still accelerating. The English countryside below was resolving from abstract coloured shapes into individual features, fields, hedgerows, a road, a farmhouse approaching with a specificity that left him no comfort at all. He reached for the elevator trim tabs. In normal flight, trim tabs are maintenance controls, used to remove steady-state load from the pilot's grip on a long mission, not to fly the aircraft. They operate through a separate mechanical pathway from the elevator itself. They weren't designed for what Bonar needed them to do. He wound them back. Nothing happened immediately. He wound them further. The nose began to lift, barely perceptibly at first, then by degrees, as denser air at lower altitude restored some aerodynamic authority to the tail surfaces. He pulled out. He levelled off somewhere below 10,000 feet, turned for Langley, and brought the aircraft home. The ground crew walked out to the aircraft and found wingskins shuddering and flapping, distorted by aerodynamic loads the structure had never been intended to carry at those speeds. The Typhoon was written off. Bonar had survived what they were beginning to call compressibility, a phenomenon that aeronautical scientists had understood in principle for a decade, but had never seen manifest so brutally in a frontline aircraft, at operational speeds, without adequate warning and without any protocol for handling it. He wasn't the first Typhoon pilot to encounter it. He was one of the first to understand what had happened and come back to say so. Others had simply not come back. The Tiffy, RAF slang, had settled on the nickname almost immediately after the aircraft entered service in September 1941, had 3 serious engineering problems. Its wing was too thick, causing performance to deteriorate sharply above 20,000 feet, and making high-speed dives a genuine gamble against survival. Its engine, the Napier Sabre, a 24-cylinder H-configuration sleeve valve machine that no one in the world had yet mastered at production scale, was demanding a full overhaul every 25 flight hours, catching fire on cold weather starts and generating noise and vibration at levels that exhausted pilots over long missions. Its tail was killing people in the air without warning. A structural failure in the elevator mass balance attachment caused rear fuselages to separate in flight. 23 pilots were killed, and up to 28 aircraft were lost that way before investigators established the cause. Figures drawn from partial wartime records. None of those problems killed the Typhoon program. Together, they built its successor. By March 1941, Sidney Cam had already been thinking past the aircraft he had just delivered. Cam had been chief designer at Hawker since 1925. By 1937, roughly 84% of the RAF's aircraft were designs carrying his name. The Heart, the Fury, the Hurricane. The Typhoon was his too, and the problems emerging in early service were problems he took personally, not because they embarrassed him, but because he understood them precisely enough to know what to do about them. He formally proposed a redesign that month. The initial concept was called the Typhoon II, internally designated the Hawker P.1012, built around a fundamentally different wing and a more powerful Napier Sabre 4 engine. The Air Ministry issued specification F.10/41 on November 18, 1941, contracting for 2 prototypes. Unusually, the specification had been drafted around Hawker's existing proposal rather than issued as an open requirement, a sign that the Ministry's Director of Technical Development trusted Cam's diagnosis. A 45-man drafting team at Hawker's Wartime Experimental Design Office at Claremont in Esher began converting the proposal into technical schematics. On February 28, 1942, the Air Ministry renamed the aircraft. It was no longer the Typhoon II. It was the Tempest. On September 2, 1942, Philip Lucas, Hawker's chief test pilot, the same man who had made an emergency landing with a cracked Typhoon fuselage in May 1940 and been awarded the George Medal for it, flew prototype HM599 from Langley, Berkshire. The aircraft retained the Typhoon's framed canopy and chin radiator in that first configuration. In February 1943, pilots from the Aeroplane and Armament Experimental Establishment at Boscombe Down flew it and produced their assessment. About the Typhoon, Boscombe Down had been writing qualified, cautious reports with significant caveats since 1941. About the Tempest, they wrote that they were impressed by a manoeuvrable and pleasant aircraft to fly, with no major handling faults. That sentence had not been written about a Hawker Typhoon in 2 years of service. To understand what the Tempest actually was, you need the physics of why the Typhoon's wing had failed. A wing moving through air accelerates the flow over its upper surface. The thicker the wing, the more the airflow must accelerate to pass over it. At high speed, the locally accelerated airflow above a thick wing reaches the speed of sound before the aircraft itself does. A shock wave forms at that point. Drag rises sharply and immediately. The boundary layer, the thin layer of air adjacent to the wing surface, separates. Lift drops. The aircraft's aerodynamic center shifts rearward, producing a pitch-down tendency the elevators can't counter because the wing is no longer generating the forces the tail was designed to balance. The pilot feels buffet, then loss of control, then a stick in his hand that moves freely and does nothing at all. This is what happened to Bonar. This is what had been happening to Typhoon pilots in dives since 1941. The Typhoon's wing section was a NACA 22 series aerofoil with a thickness-to-chord ratio of 19.5% at the root, tapering to 12% at the tip. Maximum thickness sat at 30% of the way back along the chord, an early position that forced the airflow to accelerate quickly near the leading edge. Below 300 miles per hour, this created no serious problems. The Typhoon at those speeds was a capable, powerful aircraft, as Roland Beaumont and the pilots who flew it in low-level interception work understood well. Near 500 in a dive, the thick wing became lethal, and the Typhoon's powerful engine made 500 in a dive very easy to reach. Hawker's engineers had been investigating NACA's laminar flow research since March 1940. The Americans had been developing a family of aerofoil profiles designed to keep the boundary layer attached to the wing surface for longer, postponing the pressure peak and delaying shockwave formation to a significantly higher speed. The North American P-51 Mustang flew with one of these profiles. Hawker designed their own, a Hawker-specific section, not a standard NACA number, internally designated H/1414/37.5 at the root and H/1410/37.5 at the tip. Those designations encode the critical measurements. Root thickness to chord fell from 19.5% on the Typhoon to 14.5% on the Tempest. Tip ratio fell from 12 to 10. The wing at the root was physically 5 inches thinner. Maximum thickness moved from 30% of the chord to 37.5%, further back where the boundary layer had more distance to develop before encountering the thickest section of the aerofoil. That geometry is precisely how a laminar flow profile works. Airflow stays smooth and attached longer. The shock wave forms later, and the aircraft reaches a substantially higher speed before compressibility effects become dangerous. The planform changed simultaneously. The Typhoon's fully elliptical wing gave way to a semi-elliptical shape, with modified tips, slightly shorter in overall span. The surface finish was held to standards Hawker had not previously attempted in production, because laminar flow is sensitive to imperfections. A rivet head projecting even fractionally can trip the boundary layer and undermine the entire aerodynamic advantage the profile was designed to create. Flush riveting, applied with wartime factory precision, was essential. The performance gain wasn't incremental. The Tempest Mark V reached approximately 440 miles per hour in operational level flight. The Tempest Mark I prototype, the version equipped with the more powerful Sabre 4 and with radiators moved from the chin into the wing leading edges, reached 466 miles per hour at 24,500 feet during test flights. The Typhoon had been designed to achieve 400 miles per hour at 20,000 feet and had barely managed it. The Tempest exceeded that figure at nearly 5,000 feet higher. The RAF's own tactical trials concluded the Tempest 5 was superior to the Spitfire Mark 14, the Griffon-engine Spitfire the service regarded as its standard of fighter performance in 1944, below 20,000 feet. Below 10,000 feet, the Tempest was the fastest single-engine piston-driven aircraft operating in European airspace. The new wing created a structural consequence almost immediately. The Typhoon had carried fuel in leading-edge tanks built into the thick wing root, forward nose tanks of 37 gallons each, supplemented by main bay tanks outboard of the undercarriage wells. The Tempest wing had no room for them. The leading-edge tanks were gone. Hawker had to find 76 gallons of fuel somewhere else. The answer was the fuselage nose. A new 21-inch fuel bay was built immediately forward of the cockpit, between the oil tank and the engine firewall, housing a 76-gallon tank. 2 interspar wing tanks of 28 gallons each supplemented it, and late production Tempest 5s added a 30-gallon tank in the port wing root leading edge. Total internal fuel capacity reached 162 gallons, more than the Typhoon had carried despite losing the wing tanks entirely. The engineering logic of the relocation was clean. The fuel went to exactly the place the airframe could accommodate it without compromising the new wing's aerodynamic geometry. Moving that weight forward had consequences. The new nose tank shifted the aircraft's center of gravity forward. A heavier nose reduced directional stability, and the tail surfaces, initially sized for a Typhoon-length fuselage, no longer had sufficient moment arm to counteract it. The fuselage grew by approximately 2 feet, bringing the Tempest Mark V's overall length to 33 feet 8 inches. The tail moment arm was restored. Stability returned. But the tail itself needed to change, and for reasons that went well beyond simple geometry. The Typhoon tail failures had begun appearing in service from late 1941, and for a disturbing period that stretched through most of 1942, the investigators examining them could find no pattern they could confidently explain. The failures didn't occur during high-G maneuvers or at the outer limits of the flight envelope, which would have made them easier to interpret. They occurred at speeds and conditions that should have been safe, without external warning, without the physical precursors that usually preceded structural events. Test pilot Ken Seth Smith, Hawker's second test pilot, deputizing for Lucas, was conducting a straightforward level speed run from Langley in August 1942 when his aircraft broke apart over Thorpe and killed him. Cam immediately ruled out pilot error. Investigation found the answer. The elevator mass balance had torn free of its fuselage attachment point, triggering catastrophic flutter that propagated through the rear fuselage structure until the tail separated entirely. Modification 286, applied from the 820th production aircraft onward, beginning in December 1942, strengthened the structure and the control runs. It was a partial fix. Failures continued at a reduced rate. Modification 256 added a doubler plate on the inboard ends of the tailplane spars. By mid-1943, the Royal Aircraft Establishment had completed resonance testing that identified the root cause with full precision. Inertia coupling between elevator motion and the natural vibration frequency of the fuselage structure, building into a destructive flutter cycle at specific combinations of speed and control input. Modification 353 targeted this directly. A substantial inertia weight added to the control column and a modified weight on the elevator mass balance itself. The failures stopped. The Tempest's tail was designed with every one of those lessons already incorporated. Enlarged vertical and horizontal surfaces, structurally different from the Typhoon's original empennage in ways that went beyond scale. The first production Tempest 5s did carry external reinforcing fish plates around the rear fuselage joint, carrying the Typhoon's cautionary engineering legacy into the new aircraft's early production run. As operational experience built confidence in the revised structure, the fish plates became unnecessary. The rear fuselage became fully detachable, a clean structural solution that the Typhoon with its bolted-on reinforcing plates visible to any ground crew who walked around the aircraft, had never achieved. The Typhoon had worn its structural anxiety on the outside. The Tempest built that anxiety out of the design. One engineering decision, to fix the compressibility problem with a thinner wing, had cascaded through the entire airframe. The thin wing demanded new fuel arrangements. The new fuel arrangements demanded a longer fuselage. The longer fuselage demanded a redesigned and enlarged tail. Every change was forced by the one before it. The Tempest wasn't an improved Typhoon. It was what a Typhoon became when its own failure modes were mapped precisely and followed to their logical engineering conclusions. The wing was the most consequential problem. The tail was the most dangerous. The engine was the one that had nearly destroyed pilot confidence entirely. The Napier Sabre was a 24-cylinder liquid-cooled H-block, two flat 12-cylinder banks stacked horizontally, sharing a common crankcase, using sleeve valves instead of the conventional poppet valves every other major aero engine of the era employed. The sleeve valve arrangement offered excellent power density, but it depended on machining tolerances and material specifications that Napier's production capabilities in 1941 and 1942 couldn't consistently achieve. In early service, the majority of failures centered on the sleeves and their drive mechanisms. Wear, seizing, and cascading failures that appeared without predictable intervals and left ground crews with an engine they couldn't fully trust. The operational consequences were severe. A full engine overhaul was required every 25 flight hours, an interval that would have been considered inadequate in a training environment, let alone front-line operations. In cold weather, starting the Sabre required precise execution of an oil dilution procedure using the Kigas priming system, which most pilots and mechanics hadn't been taught correctly. Mishandle it and the engine refused to start or caught fire, sometimes in quick succession. The 24-cylinder note at full power was uniquely fatiguing, a high-pitched, hammering din unlike anything else in the RAF inventory, and the vibration it transmitted into the airframe and the pilot's seat accumulated across long missions into a physical exhaustion that compounded every other difficulty. Beaumont had his first Typhoon flight on March 8, 1942 at Langley, in a Mark 1A with 12 machine guns. He describes what he found with the directness of someone who had decided to advocate for the aircraft while fully aware of its faults. The noise, the vibration, the drafty cockpit with its rattling wind-up side windows. Once a pilot accepted all of that, he wrote in Phoenix into Ashes, it was soon apparent that the aeroplane was pleasantly stable and responsive to controls in all axes, very manoeuvrable, and it had a tremendous turn of speed. That assessment, coming from one of the shrewdest operational pilots of his generation, was the argument that kept the Typhoon alive in 1942 and 1943, when engineering branch within Fighter Command was seriously weighing cancellation in favour of the American P-47 Thunderbolt. Beaumont fought that battle with his operational record and his direct advocacy. He won it. By January 1944, when the Tempest entered squadron service, the Sabre had improved considerably. Bristol's engineers, who brought decades of sleeve valve radial experience from their own engine program, had worked with Napier to identify and address the worst of the sleeve drive failures at a manufacturing level. New tolerances and materials, applied consistently at production scale, brought serviceability to levels that operational squadrons could sustain. The Sabre 2A, fitted to the first 100 Tempest Mark V Series 1 aircraft, produced approximately 2,180 horsepower. Series 2 aircraft, from the 101st onward, flew with the Sabre 2B and 2C. The engine that had nearly destroyed the program was, by 1944, becoming manageable. Not because the problem had been forgotten, but because it had been traced to its materials source and fixed there. Hawker had also prepared an alternative. The Tempest Mark II, powered by the Bristol Centaurus 18-cylinder radial, producing approximately 2,210 horsepower, first flew in June 1943. Its first production aircraft followed in September 1944, too late for wartime combat service in Europe. India and Pakistan received Tempest IIs after partition in 1947. The Sabre question had been answered by that point, but the Centaurus variant demonstrated that the Tempest's airframe could carry a different heart, and the lesson wasn't lost on what came next. The first production Tempest Mark V, serial JN729, rolled off Hawker's Langley facility on June 21, 1943. The first 100 Series 1 aircraft came equipped with four 20mm Hispano Mark II cannon with long barrels that projected slightly ahead of the wing leading edges. The remaining 701 Series 2 aircraft switched to the short-barreled Hispano Mark II, muzzles flush with the leading edge. A cleaner installation and the more capable weapon, with the whole aircraft carrying 800 rounds total across the four guns. Both series could carry up to 2,000 pounds of external stores beneath the wings, though bomb operations remained limited in practice, and rockets were never used operationally by Tempest Vs during the war. First deliveries reached squadrons in January 1944. By April, Wing Commander Roland Beaumont, the man whose operational advocacy had kept the Typhoon alive 2 years earlier, had stood up 150 wing at Castle Camps in Cambridgeshire, the first 3-squadron Tempest wing. No. 3 Squadron RAF and No. 486 Squadron RNZAF received their aircraft. No. 56 Squadron flew Spitfire 9s while awaiting conversion. By May, the wing had moved forward to RAF Newchurch in Kent, an advanced landing ground close enough to the French coast that a patrol could be on a V1 track within minutes of taking off, and the whole formation was declared operational. D-Day, June 6, 1944, passed without major aerial engagement for the Tempest squadrons. 2 days later, Beaumont led a sweep behind the Normandy beachhead and found 5 Messerschmitt B F-109Gs in line astern, 5,000 feet below his formation. He transmitted briefly on the radio, pushed the nose down, and took No. 3 Squadron into the bounce. The Tempests closed fast. The 109 pilots had no warning until cannon fire was registering on their aircraft. For most of the Tempest pilots, it was their first clear sense of what the new aircraft could do in a high-speed approach. The control authority that the thin wing maintained at speeds that had made the Typhoon erratic. The closing rate that left opponents no time to react. The way the 4-cannon punch arrived before the tactical situation had finished being assessed. 6 days after that, everything changed. June 13th, 1944. 4 V1 flying bombs crossed the English coast in the early hours of the morning. 3 were brought down or landed short. The 4th reached Bethnal Green in East London and killed 6 people, seriously injuring 9 more. The age of missile warfare had begun. The Germans designated it the FZG-76, Fieseler Gerät 76, and called it the Vergeltungswaffe 1 in the propaganda surrounding its deployment. The British called it the buzz bomb for the staccato pulse of its Argus AS-014 motor. From the ground, the sound was unmistakable, a low, rhythmic throb like an enormous two-stroke engine cutting across the sky at around 3,000 feet. When the sound stopped, when the pulse jet exhausted its fuel and went silent, the people below had perhaps 15 seconds before impact. There was nothing systematic to do in 15 seconds. The silence was the worst part. From the air, it looked different. The Argus pulse jet produced a visible exhaust plume, an orange flame strobing at about 47 pulses per second, visible in daylight as a bright point on the tail of the flying bomb, and visible at night from several miles away as a moving light that pilots at altitude could track against the darkness below. Chasing a V-1 at night meant following that pulse, closing on a machine with no pilot, no consciousness, no evasion instinct, flying a fixed course on gyroscopic autopilot toward a city. The men who hunted them described the quality of it as unlike anything else in the air war. A purely mechanical target, indifferent to pursuit, carrying 850 kilograms of explosive toward houses. The V-1 crossed the English coast at approximately 340 miles per hour and accelerated as it descended toward its cruise altitude of 1,000 to 1,200 meters. By the time it reached the London Civil Defence region, it was travelling at close to 400 miles per hour. RAF analysts identified the problem immediately. Over the weeks and months of the campaign, 10,492 land-launched V-1s would follow that first one. Of those, 2,419 would reach London. They would kill 5,476 people. Operation Diver, the RAF's response, began almost immediately. The problem was acute and obvious. A V-1 flying at 400 miles per hour at between 3,000 and 4,000 feet presented an interception geometry that most RAF fighters in service simply couldn't solve. Spitfire Mark 5s couldn't catch them at all. Mark 9s could intercept with altitude advantage and a pre-positioned dive, but the margin was narrow enough that a late scramble or a degree of poor positioning made success near impossible. The Mustang III had sufficient speed at low altitude in some conditions. The Gloucester Meteor, which entered frontline service the same month the V-1 campaign began, destroyed 13 flying bombs before gun jamming problems severely curtailed its operations. The only aircraft in the RAF's inventory with the consistent low-altitude speed to engage V-1s reliably under real operational conditions without requiring ideal positioning to make the geometry work was the Hawker Tempest. When the campaign began in June 1944, fewer than 30 were available. The closing margin explains why this was so demanding. A Tempest Mark V at full operational boost reached 435 to 440 miles per hour. A V-1 near London flew at close to 400. That left a margin of 5 to 40 miles per hour. The variance depending on altitude, boost setting, whether the pilot had built speed in a prior dive, and the direction of the approach. For a pilot who caught a V-1 in level flight from behind without height advantage, the arithmetic was worse. The standard technique was to position above the V-1's predicted track and dive as the flying bomb passed below, trading altitude for velocity. There was no comfortable margin. No situation where interception felt routine. Every engagement required precise geometry and full throttle, and even then the outcome wasn't certain. Firing when you reached that geometry was its own calculation. The Hispano 20mm cannon fired explosive shells. If they detonated, the V-1's warhead at close range, the explosion would destroy the attacking aircraft along with its target. The Argus pulse jet engine was nearly immune to conventional cannon fire. no moving parts in the airflow, capable of sustaining multiple penetrations and continuing to provide thrust as long as fuel reached the combustion chamber. The only reliable kills came from attacking the warhead directly, at distances that produced lethal damage to the flying bomb without creating lethal blast conditions for the pilot. Experienced V-1 hunters developed their preferred attack distances through operational practice, which is to say, through learning what range allowed them to walk away from their own kill. Some pilots found a way to destroy a V-1 without firing at all. If a Tempest pilot could position his wingtip directly beneath the V-1's wing, at the same altitude, at the same speed, within a few feet of an 850-kilogram warhead, the difference in airflow between the two surfaces created a pressure differential that disrupted the gyroscopic guidance system. The flying bomb would roll away from its course and fall off target without detonating. No blast risk, no cannon fire required. The tipping method demanded extraordinary precision at very low altitude, and the acceptance of a collision risk that no calm assessment of probabilities made comfortable. One Tempest pilot lost his life attempting it. Most kills came from gun attacks, and the tipping maneuver was real tactical practice rather than a primary method. But in an aircraft with the Tempest's speed and control authority at low altitude, it was physically possible in a way it simply wasn't in any other type. No. 3 Squadron claimed the first V-1 kill for 150 wing on June 16, 1944, 3 days into the campaign. 3 days after that, on June 19th, Roland Beament became the first pilot in the campaign to score 5 V-1 victories, making him the RAF's first V-1 ace before any pilot of any other nation had reached that mark. On the night of 22nd June, he intercepted and destroyed his first V-1 at night, southeast England, following the orange pulse through darkness until the range closed and the fore cannon had the right angle. Flying Officer Ted Koch of No. 3 Squadron departed RAF Newchurch on anti-diver patrol at 5:45 on July 1, 1944, flying Tempest JN 765. He was vectored onto a V-1 inbound toward London and closed to intercept near Rye in East Sussex. British anti-aircraft guns, simultaneously engaging the same flying bomb, struck his aircraft. JN 765 came down at Winchelsea Marsh in Icklesham. Ted Koch was killed, not by the enemy's weapon, but by the failure of coordination between two simultaneous defensive systems operating in the same airspace, each hunting the same target, neither always knowing where the other was pointing. Pilot Officer Roland John Wright of No. 486 Squadron, RNZAF, died differently. Flying Tempest 5JN 804, callsign SA-R, from Newchurch, Wright shot down a V-1 and was caught in the detonation blast as his aircraft passed through the radius of the explosion. He was one of 3 486 Squadron pilots killed during the campaign. A further 10 were seriously injured. 17 Tempests were written off in anti-diver operations. No. 486 Squadron, RNZAF, finished the campaign as the most successful Tempest unit by individual score. 223.5 confirmed V-1 kills across the summer months of the land-launched campaign. Squadron leader Harvey Sweetman had accumulated 9 V-1s plus 1 shared kill by mid-July 1944. Flying Officer R.J. Cammack was credited with 20 kills plus 1 shared. No. 3 Squadron's total reached 257, the highest for any anti-diver unit. Together, the three Newchurch Wing squadrons claimed more than 800 V1s destroyed. Two individual scores stand apart from the rest. Remy van Lierde, a Belgian pilot flying Tempests with the RAF, destroyed 36.5 V1s across the campaign, a total built through consistent operational flying across multiple months and attack geometries, placing him among the highest credited individual pilots of the entire anti-diver operation. Roland Beaumont, who commanded 150 Wing from the front throughout and flew combat missions while simultaneously managing 3 squadrons through the most demanding home defence operation since the summer of 1940, finished with 31 confirmed V1 kills. Then there was Joseph Berry. Squadron leader Joseph Berry, DFC, and 2 bars, commanded No. 501 Squadron, which converted from Spitfire VEs to Tempests in June 1944 and flew anti-diver operations from Friston on the South Downs. Berry was 23 years old when the campaign began, and he flew it with a methodical intensity that distinguished him from pilots who were simply accumulating victories in the course of normal operations. Where other successful V1 hunters settled on preferred attack geometries and repeated them, Berry adapted. Different altitudes, different approach angles, different lead times, across an operational record that would eventually total 59.5 confirmed V1 kills. No pilot of any nationality in any aircraft type scored more. On October 2nd, 1944, Berry's Tempest crashed near Sevenum in the Netherlands. He was killed. On that same afternoon, Roland Beaumont shot down a Focke-Wulf 190 over Volkel in Holland, his last aerial victory. Shortly afterward, his aircraft was hit and he was forced down, taken prisoner. The 2 men who had defined the Tempest's V1 campaign in different ways, one as its commanding officer, one as its highest scorer, reached their respective endpoints on the same day. The land-launched campaign against Britain ended officially on September 1st, 1944, when Allied ground forces overran the launch sites in France and Belgium. By that date, Tempest pilots had destroyed 638 V1 flying bombs, 34% of every aircraft kill against V1s across all Allied types combined. No other single aircraft type came close. An air-launched campaign, with German bombers releasing weapons over the North Sea at altitude, continued through the winter. Its final recorded attack was 28th March 1945. Every one of those 638 kills was a bomb that didn't land in London. By autumn 1944, the Tempest wings had moved to the continent as part of the 2nd Tactical Air Force. The aircraft that had been designed to cure an aerodynamic problem was now meeting the Luftwaffe's best at low and medium altitude. And the result answered whatever questions remained about what Sidney Cam's redesign had actually produced. The Focke-Wulf 190D9 appeared in Luftwaffe frontline service in late summer 1944. The D9, long-nosed, powered by the UMO 213A, called the Dora by those who flew it, was a genuine performance leap over the 190A series at medium altitude. German test pilots were enthusiastic. Allied intelligence took it seriously. The D9 had been developed partly in direct response to the threat posed by high-performance Allied fighters over occupied Europe, and it was, by any honest measurement, among the best piston-engine fighters Germany produced in the entire war. Against the Tempest at low and medium altitude, the D9 was an even contest. Both types had service ceilings around 33,000 feet and comparable rates of climb at medium altitude. Speed comparison at low level showed the two closely matched below 4,500 meters, with the Tempest holding a slight advantage between roughly 1,700 and 2,500 meters. The altitude band of every low-level sweep, every road attack, every airfield strafing run across the Rhine and into Germany's interior in the war's final winter. Historical records credit Tempest pilots with 239 confirmed air-to-air kills across the war's final year. The D9 pilots who faced them knew the margin. In December 1944, during the Battle of the Bulge, Tempest wings operating from the Netherlands flew in the worst winter weather of the European air war. Freezing fog, low cloud, and short operational days that compressed all the flying into a narrow window of acceptable visibility. In that single month, they claimed 52 German fighters shot down and 89 trains and other vehicles destroyed, for the loss of 20 Tempests. Pierre Clostermann, the French pilot who had flown Spitfires with the RAF since 1943 and transferred to Tempests in 1944, later writing the memoir The Big Show about both aircraft, accumulated 11.5 aerial victories in the Tempest alone across hundreds of combat hours. He described what made the aircraft different in the low-level environment: the speed, the stability in a high-speed dive, the 4-cannon punch that could destroy a locomotive in a single firing pass and leave the aircraft still controllable at 50 feet. The Me-262 put the Tempest in a category of its own. The Messerschmitt Me-262 entered Luftwaffe frontline service in 1944 as the world's first operational jet fighter, with a maximum speed of approximately 540 miles per hour. No piston-engine aircraft could pursue one in level flight. The speed gap was 100 miles per hour, enough that a straight chase was simply not available as a tactic. Tempest pilots didn't try. They identified the airfields from which Me-262 units were operating, Rhein, Achmer, Hessepe, and flew to altitude above them and waited. A jet on final approach, throttle back to landing speed, gear deployed, descending at a few hundred feet per minute, is no faster than any other aircraft in that phase of flight. From altitude, in a dive, a Tempest built to 450 miles per hour or beyond and arrived at airfield level with an energy advantage the jet pilot had no time to counter. The Me-262's Jumo turbojets were slow to spool up from low power settings, and the altitude margin available for a break-off and climb was narrow. A pilot who looked back and saw a Tempest in a diving attack had seconds to act, and the geometry often didn't give him those seconds. The tactic worked because the Tempest was fast enough and because the jet's vulnerability during landing was absolute. Hubert Lang flew 15 combat missions in Me-262s with JG-51. He saw the Tempest from the other side of that equation and described it with a precision that tactical officers reserve for threats they genuinely fear. Extremely fast at low altitudes, highly maneuverable and heavily armed. A Luftwaffe jet pilot, a man who flew the world's first operational jet fighter, named the piston-engine Tempest as his most dangerous opponent. Between October 1944 and May 1945, Tempest pilots claimed over 30 Me-262s destroyed. A Tempest was also credited with the first Allied kill of the Heinkel He-162 Volksjäger, Germany's emergency jet fighter program, which entered limited frontline service in April 1945. Whether every claim against jet aircraft can be individually verified against Luftwaffe loss records is uncertain. The documentary situation for the war's final weeks is fragmentary on both sides. But the operational pattern was clear enough that the Luftwaffe explicitly modified the procedures of Me-262 units to account for the threat Tempests posed near their own airfields. One calibration is worth making. The Spitfire Mark 14, Rolls-Royce Griffon 65 engine, 5-bladed propeller, around 2,220 horsepower, was the RAF's finest high-altitude fighter of 1944 and 1945. It outclimbed the Tempest at every altitude. Above 20,000 feet, its dogfight performance was decisively superior. Lower wing loading, better energy retention in thin air. The Griffon's supercharger maintaining high power output at altitudes where the Sabre's performance was already falling away. Above 30,000 feet, the Tempest couldn't compete with it. The RAF's own tactical trials stated the result plainly. The Tempest was better below about 20,000 feet, and the Spitfire 14 above that height. The Spitfire 14 was an outstanding aircraft. The Tempest had been built for a different operational environment, and from May 1944 to May 1945, that environment was the one in which the war in Western Europe was actually fought. At low altitude, at high speed, over channel crossings and French fields and German airfields, and the Rhine in flood. Sidney Cam's draftsman was still working when the fighting ended. The Tempest was the last of his designs to see operational service in World War II. But it wasn't the end of the engineering lineage. In September 1942, the same month HM599 first flew from Langley, Cam had begun design work on a lighter, carrier-capable derivative. The project, initiated in response to a Royal Air Force requirement for a light Tempest fighter, and subsequently taken over by the Royal Navy, eventually became the Hawker Sea Fury. Both the semi-elliptical wing and the fuselage form of the Sea Fury originated directly from the Tempest, adapted and scaled for naval operations, and equipped with the Bristol Centaurus engine. The Sea Fury fought in Korea from 1950, and its wing section traced a straight line back to the laminar flow research that had driven Cam's original redesign a decade earlier. The Tempest Mark II served the RAF in occupied Germany after the war ended, and equipped the initial air arms of both India and Pakistan after partition in 1947. The Mark VI followed in limited numbers. The name appeared in RAF use through the early 1950s, gradually replaced by the jets that the Tempest's operational success had made certain would come. The programme's aggregate wartime record: 239 confirmed air-to-air kills for Tempest pilots across the war's final year, 638 V-1 flying bombs destroyed, encounters with Germany's jet programme at its full operational height, and operations that ran without interruption from the Normandy coast to the Baltic shores. Every number traced back to the same decision made in 1940, when Cam's design office first began asking what a Typhoon would look like if its wing changed. The Typhoon hadn't failed. It had found the edges of what its design could achieve, at real cost. The tail failures killed at least 23 pilots before engineers understood the mechanism. The Sabre's early unreliability killed others indirectly, through forced landings and engine fires, and nearly killed the programme through the loss of confidence it generated in the squadrons and at command level. The compressibility incidents took pilots in dives who never understood what was happening. In every one of those failures, Hawker's engineers eventually produced a precise diagnosis. Into the aircraft that came next, they built the correction. Squadron leader Joseph Berry died near Sevenham on October 2, 1944, aged 23, at the top of a V1 scoring list no other pilot reached. Pilot officer Roland John Wright was killed by the blast from the flying bomb he had just destroyed. Flying officer Ted Koch was killed by his own side's guns over a Kent marsh on a July morning, chasing a machine with no pilot. Harvey Sweetman and R.J. Cammock and the pilots of No. 486 Squadron, RNZAF, flew their tours from Newchurch to Volkel to Lübeck and carried 223.5 flying bomb kills and 59 aerial victories between them. Roland Beaumont came home. He flew test aircraft after the war, the English electric Canberra, the Lightning, and wrote about the Typhoon and the Tempest with the clarity of someone who had spent 4 years making the case for both. He died in November 2001, aged 81. The Typhoon's problems didn't kill the program. They built something better. The men who flew what was built deserve to be remembered by name, and they deserve to have the story told accurately. If your father, your grandfather, or anyone in your family served in a Tempest or a Typhoon squadron with the RAF, the RCAF, the Royal New Zealand Air Force, or any other service, tell us in the comments. Their names belong in the record. Subscribe for more stories like this one.